She walked out of that ballroom with her spine straight and her hands steady, and every person who watched her go understood, in the marrow of their comfortable bones, that they were witnessing something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. Not grief, not defeat. Something older and more dangerous than either. The kind of stillness that only comes from a woman who has already decided the war is over, and that she won it by leaving. Stay with this story, because what happens next is not what any of them expected, and by the end, you will understand exactly why. This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. That's. The morning it ended had begun like every other morning in Blackthorn House, with the smell of beeswax and old money, with the soft percussion of servants' feet on marble, with the particular quality of light that poured through the east-facing windows of the Duchess's suite and made everything look like it had been painted by someone commissioned to make wealth appear inevitable. Seraphina Ashbourne had been awake since before that light arrived. She sat at her writing desk in a dressing gown the color of ash, her dark hair loose over one shoulder, a letter half finished in front of her. The letter was to Lord Creswell Hartley, the Treasury liaison for the Northern Provinces, and it was the third in a negotiation she had been conducting quietly for 7 months. A negotiation that would, if it concluded as she intended, secure the Blackthorn family's mineral rights along the Aldermere River corridor for another 40 years. She wrote in a small, precise hand. She had a gift for making complex financial architecture sound like simple courtesy. She did not finish the letter that morning. At 7:30, her lady's maid, Dorothea, knocked and entered with the particular urgency she reserved for situations she considered above her authority to interpret. "Your Grace," Dorothea's voice had gone tight. "His Grace requests your presence in the East drawing room." He said. She stopped. "What did he say, Dorothea?" "He said to come immediately, and that you should not—" Another pause, longer. "That you should not bring your correspondence." Seraphina set down her pen. She looked at the half-finished letter for a moment, at the careful sentences she had built to protect a man who, she would understand within the hour, had already decided she was expendable. Then she folded it, placed it in the left drawer of her desk, and stood. "Tell him I'll be down in 20 minutes. He said immediately, Your Grace." "I heard what he said." She moved to her wardrobe without looking at Dorothea again. 20 minutes. She dressed herself that morning. A deliberate choice, though she could not have said why she made it, only that something in her chest had tightened when Dorothea delivered the message. Something old and animal and accurate, and she understood without articulating it that she needed the 20 minutes not for vanity, but for armor. She chose a deep charcoal gown, high-necked and perfectly tailored. No jewelry except her wedding ring and a single pearl at each ear. She pinned her hair herself, which she had not done in years, and the act of it, the feeling of her own hands against her own head, steadied something that had begun to shake. She looked at herself in the glass for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went downstairs. Duke Rowan Blackthorn was standing at the window when she entered the east drawing room, his back to her, one hand braced against the frame. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of physical authority that rooms reorganize themselves around. At 38, he was still striking. Sharp jaw, dark gold hair, the angular handsomeness of a man who had never been forced to develop charm because presence had always been sufficient. He did not turn when she entered. There were 2 other people in the room. One was Lord Fenwick Aldrich, Rowan's solicitor, a small, precise man who kept his eyes on the floor. The other was a woman Seraphina had seen at 3 social functions in the past year and had not permitted herself to examine too closely. Vivian Hale was 26 years old, and she was extraordinarily beautiful in the particular way of women who have learned to weaponize the fact of their beauty with surgical precision. She wore a morning dress the color of cream, and her copper hair was arranged with a carelessness that had clearly required considerable effort. She was standing near the fireplace, and her hands were folded in front of her, and she had the expression of a woman who has rehearsed this scene many times and is now slightly disappointed by how quickly it has arrived. She was also, unmistakably, pregnant. Seraphina did not allow her eyes to move from Rowan's back. She crossed the room at a measured pace, stopped at the center of the rug, and waited. Close the door, Rowan said. Fenwick Aldrich, who had been the one nearest the door, clicked it shut behind him. The sound was very small in that large room. Rowan turned from the window. He looked at her, and for a moment, a very brief moment that she would catalogue and examine later in the silence of a different life, something moved through his expression that might have been difficulty, might have been the faintest edge of a man who understood he was about to do something that could not be undone. Then it closed over. His jaw set. His eyes went flat in the way she had seen them go flat when he was negotiating something he had already decided. Serafina. Rowan. Her voice was perfectly level. She had made sure of it on the stairs. I'll be direct. I'd be grateful. He glanced at Vivian, not with tenderness, she noted, but with the checking glance of a man confirming that his plan is still in place, and then looked back at her. Vivian is carrying my child, my heir. The pregnancy is 4 months along, and the physician confirms it is healthy. He paused. I intend to formally establish the child's legitimacy. To do so in a manner that protects the Blackthorn name, certain arrangements must be made. Serafina said nothing. You will be relocated to Ashbourne Cottage in the countryside. The estate will provide a monthly allowance sufficient for comfortable living. You will be listed as residing there for health reasons. The official narrative will be that you and I have agreed amicably to a formal separation while the succession matter is resolved. He reached for a document on the writing table behind him and held it toward her. Lord Aldrich has prepared the paperwork. It is straightforward. She looked at the document. She did not take it. And in exchange, she said, for signing this paperwork and disappearing into a cottage so that your mistress can move into the rooms I have occupied for 6 years. Serafina, I'm asking a clarifying question, Rowan. What is the exchange? His mouth tightened. You retain the Ashbourne family name. You retain your allowance. You retain your dignity. The words sat in the room for a moment. Vivian shifted near the fireplace. It was a small movement, a shoulder, a slight adjustment of weight, and it was the first thing she had done since Serafina entered, and Serafina turned her head and looked at her directly for the first time. The women regarded each other. Vivian had clearly prepared for hostility. She had prepared for tears, for accusations, for the particular desperation of a wife who has nowhere to go. What she had not prepared for was the quality of attention Serafina directed at her, calm and exact, and somehow more intimate than anger, the attention of a person cataloging something with complete precision. How long, Serafina said, still looking at Vivian, have you been in this house? Vivian opened her mouth. I'm not asking you, Serafina said. The words were not sharp, they were simply final. She turned back to Rowan. How long has she been sleeping in my house? That's not relevant to... 8 months, Fenwick Aldrich said. Everyone looked at him. He appeared to have surprised himself. He was still looking at the floor. 8 months. Serafina did the arithmetic without effort or drama. 8 months ago she had been in the northern provinces for 3 weeks, managing a dispute between the Hartley estate and 2 Blackthorn tenant families that had threatened to become a legal matter, a dispute no one had asked her to manage. A dispute she had resolved in 11 days by knowing which families owed which favors and having the patience to sit in a cold provincial solicitor's office until everyone stopped posturing. She had come home to Blackthorn House to a husband who had thanked her for handling it and then gone to his study. Rowan, she said. The document is fair, he said. Lord Aldrich has... I'm not going to sign that document. The room changed temperature. Rowan's expression went through something she could not quite categorize. Surprise was part of it, but also underneath a kind of relief, as though her refusal gave him permission for something. He straightened. Serafina, be reasonable. I am being entirely reasonable. You're asking me to co-sign the legal fiction that I am relocating for my health so that your pregnant mistress can occupy the position of Duchess without the inconvenience of anyone noticing that you have simply replaced me. That is not a document I intend to sign. She paused. If you want a separation, petition for one formally. Let the courts handle it. Let everyone see exactly what is being done and why. That would be a scandal. Yes, she said. It would. He stared at her. For a moment, In the quality of his stare, she could see the man she had married. Not the man she had loved, because she had never quite loved him. And she had understood that about herself from the beginning, but the man she had respected, the one who was direct, who did not hide from consequences, who had a certain rough honesty that she had found, at 22, more appealing than romance. That man had clearly been in extended remission. "You'll have nothing," he said. His voice had gone quiet in the particular way that meant he was choosing not to shout. "If you force a formal proceeding, everything comes out. Your family's financial position when we married, the debts, what I did to clear them." "I'm aware of what you did." "Then you understand that in any public proceeding, you will not appear the wronged party. You will appear the grateful one." It was, she had to acknowledge, a well-aimed sentence. Not because it frightened her, but because it confirmed something she had suspected for some time. He had thought about this. He had thought about this carefully, had identified the exact point of leverage, had prepared it. This was not a man acting on impulse. This was a man who had planned to discard her and had spent some portion of the preceding months deciding how. She picked up the document from where he still held it extended toward her. She looked at it for a long moment. She turned it over once. She set it down on the writing table. "I won't sign it," she said, "but I'll leave." "What?" "I said I'll leave, today, without the signed paper and without a scene." She turned toward the door. "Send my trunks to whatever address you think appropriate. I'll be at the Meridian Club in the capital until I decide on permanent arrangements." "Serafina, if you leave without signing, then you'll have to decide what you want more." She paused with her hand on the door. "The legal tidiness, or my absence." She looked at him over her shoulder just once. "You can't have both." She left the door open behind her. She was in the foyer instructing Dorothea on which trunks to prepare when she heard Rowan's voice from the hall above, speaking to someone she couldn't see, his tone already reassembled into its customary command. She heard Vivian's voice answer, lighter, and then a laugh. Not cruel, just easy, the laugh of a woman who considers the difficult part to be finished. Serafina buttoned her traveling coat and did not look up. "Your Grace," Dorothea said, very quietly, "where will you go?" "I told him." She picked up her gloves from the entry table. "The Meridian Club." "And after?" She thought about the half-finished letter upstairs, about Lord Creswell Hartley and the mineral rights negotiation, and the 7 months of careful groundwork she had laid in Rowan's name without ever signing her own. She thought about the other letters, the other negotiations, the various threads she had been quietly managing for years, which he had never asked about, which he had only noticed in the aggregate sense that his affairs ran smoothly and his enemies stayed distant and his alliances held. "After," she said, pulling on the second glove, "is going to be interesting." Yeah. She did not cry in the carriage. This was not a triumph of discipline, so much as a simple fact. The grief that would have produced tears had been replaced by something that felt, to her own mild surprise, very much like clarity. She sat in the corner of the coach with her hands in her lap and watched the iron gates of Blackthorn House recede behind her and felt the city open up ahead. And what she understood, with the quiet precision of a woman who has spent 6 years paying attention to things no one else bothered to pay attention to, was that she had just been freed. It was not a comfortable freedom. Freedom rarely was, in her experience. It had edges, and those edges were presently engaged in cataloging everything she had lost. The position, the rooms she had spent 6 years arranging to suit her specific preferences, the social architecture she had spent those same years carefully constructing, the certain kind of safety that came with being attached to a name like Blackthorn, even when the attachment was loveless and increasingly thin. She had also lost, and this was the one that sat differently in her chest, heavier and stranger, the project of him. The long, patient, slightly obsessive investment of a woman who understood that her husband was neither particularly good nor particularly self-aware, but who had chosen, for reasons she had never fully examined, to compensate for both those deficiencies through the sheer quality of her own attention. She had been managing Rowan Blackthorn's life for 6 years, not his household. That was a small thing, a thing any competent woman could do. His actual life, the relationships he didn't know he had, The enemies he wasn't aware she had quietly neutralized. The alliances he benefited from and attributed, when he thought about it at all, to his own charm and the weight of the Blackthorn name. She had known, somewhere below the level of daily thought, that what she was building was not a marriage but a kind of long, elaborate proof. Proof that she was worth keeping, proof that she was more valuable than whatever the alternative might be. The carriage hit a rough stretch of cobblestones and shuddered, and she braced her hand against the doorframe and looked out the window at the city unscrolling past. The narrow streets of the merchant quarter, the better-dressed crowds of the legal district, the first bright advertisements of the capital's fashionable center. And she thought, he did not even know what he had. No, that was not quite right. He had known, in the way that people know things they have decided are not important. He had known the way you know that a wall of your house keeps the wind out. Not something you think about, just something that is simply there, that performs its function without requiring your gratitude or attention, until one day it is gone and you are cold and confused and looking at the gap where it used to be. She had allowed herself to become a wall. The thought was not self-pitying, it was diagnostic. And the next thought followed immediately, with the practical turn of a mind that had never been able to sustain grief when there was still work to do. She would not make that particular error again. The Meridian Club occupied a narrow marble-fronted building on Clarendon Street, sandwiched between a vintner of considerable reputation and a private bank whose discretion was its most valued product. It was not, strictly speaking, a place a woman of Seraphina's social standing would typically take rooms. It was a club for independent persons of means, merchants, scholars, the occasional eccentric aristocrat, and it had the particular atmosphere of a place where no one was expected to explain themselves. She had held a membership for 4 years under her maiden name. Rowan had never asked why. The concierge who received her was a man named Perths, somewhere in his 60s, who had been managing the Meridian Club's discretion since before Seraphina had learned to read. He looked at her traveling coat, at the single bag she had brought with her before the trunks could follow, at her face, and he said nothing except, "Your usual suite is available, Lady Vallemont. Shall I have tea sent up?" It was the first time anyone had called her that in 6 years. She had not expected the weight of it. She took a moment to settle it onto herself properly. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Perths." Her rooms on the 3rd floor looked east over the street, and they were precisely as she had left them on her last visit, because Perths ran an establishment where such things were maintained without being asked. She sat in the chair by the window and drank her tea while the city went about its morning below her, and she thought very carefully about what to do next. The situation, considered with the cold professional attention she typically reserved for other people's crises, was this. She was a woman of 31, married into a powerful ducal family, who had just walked out of that marriage without signing the papers that would have formalized her departure. She had no formal legal separation. She had a monthly allowance she was fairly certain Rowan would eventually attempt to curtail. She had the Meridian Club suite, which she paid for from her own account. She had a considerable network of relationships that she had spent 6 years building in her husband's name and had never thought to transfer to her own. She also had the problem, or, depending on one's perspective, the extraordinary asset, of her actual identity. She had been Seraphina Ashbourne when she married Rowan. Ashbourne was her mother's family name, the one she had used since childhood, the one attached to a small crumbling estate in the eastern provinces, and a gentle father who had died 2 years after the wedding, and a social position that was respectable and entirely unremarkable. It was a name that explained, to Rowan and to everyone who met her as his wife, why she was careful and competent and quietly useful. She had learned, they assumed, the particular discipline of a woman from a family of limited means and unlimited dignity. What Rowan had done in the year of their courtship was exactly what she had wanted him to do. He had not looked closely. He had seen a woman of modest family who was composed and intelligent and politically astute, who would be useful and would not cost him anything complicated. He had not investigated her mother's side. He had not asked why certain very powerful men treated a minor East Side Ashbourne with unusual deference at the functions where they occasionally crossed paths. He had told himself it was because she was charming, because women of her type developed that particular skill. He had married her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believes he has found a good deal. She had let him believe it, deliberately and completely. She had spent 6 years wondering if she had made the right choice. She had spent 6 years being almost certain she had, and then losing the thread of that certainty in the dailiness of a marriage that was neither warm nor cold, but simply occupied, simply functional, simply there. She had spent 6 years managing someone else's empire and slowly, almost without noticing, letting her own lie fallow. She set her cup down on the table. It was time to stop letting things lie fallow. She wrote 7 letters that afternoon. The first went to Lord Creswell Hartley, which she finished in the neat continuation of the draft she had memorized before leaving the desk at Blackthorn House. The second went to a woman named Octavia Marend, who ran a discretionary financial consultancy from an office on the 3rd floor of a building in the Exchange District, and who was one of 3 people in the capital who knew exactly who Serafina was. The third went to a man named Garrison Fell, who managed the affairs of House Valamont's central estate with the devoted precision of a man whose family had been doing exactly that for 3 generations. She had written to Garrison perhaps 12 times in the past 6 years. Brief, careful, coded letters that contained enough instruction to prevent the estate from deteriorating and little enough information to prevent anyone from connecting the Duchess of Blackthorn to the house that instruction was about. She would not be writing coded letters to Garrison Fell anymore. The 4th, 5th, and 6th letters were to contacts she had developed during her work on Rowan's behalf. A banker in the Merchant Exchange, a shipping consortium representative, a woman at the Patent and Estates Office who had, over 18 months of careful correspondence, become something closer to an ally than a professional contact. These letters were transitional in nature. They were the kind of letters that say, between their careful lines, "The name under which you have been receiving correspondence from me is changing. Pay attention to the new one." The 7th letter she did not send immediately. She sat with it for a long time in the fading afternoon light, the page blank in front of her, thinking about what she was about to begin. The 7th letter was to Prince Aldrich Voss, the king's cousin, who had been a careful and attentive ally for 3 years, and who had sent her, 2 months ago, a note so discreet it had required her to read it 4 times before she understood what he was offering. She had not responded at the time. She had filed it, like many things, under the category of possibilities she could not yet afford. She was now able to afford rather more than she had been this morning. She wrote the letter. She sealed it with the Valamont seal, which she had carried in her personal effects for 6 years, never using it, simply carrying it the way you carry something you are not ready to put down. She gave it to Perth personally when she descended for dinner, and she watched him glance at the seal, and she saw him understand something, and she saw the precise quality of his discretion reassemble itself around that understanding. "I'll see it goes tonight," he said. "Discreetly," she said. "It's the only way we do anything here, Lady Valamont." "What?" She dined alone in her rooms and did not think about Rowan, which was remarkable only because she had spent 6 years thinking about him constantly, about his schedule, his politics, his relationships, his vulnerabilities. It turned out the habit of thought was entirely professional and required only the cancellation of its subject to dissolve. She ate her meal and thought instead about Garrison Fell's last report, which had arrived 3 months ago and had contained, between its sober lines about estate maintenance and account management, the information that the Valamont holdings in the Southern Trade Corridor had increased in value by approximately 11% in the past fiscal year, and that 2 parties had approached the estate with acquisition inquiries, both of which Garrison had declined at her prior instruction. She made a note to revisit that instruction. After dinner, she stood at her window and watched the city at night, which was a different creature from the city in daylight. More honest, more various. The daytime performances stripped back to the actual business of the place. She could see from her 3rd-floor window the lit windows of the Exchange District, the moving lanterns of the night market, the distant glow of what she knew to be the palace's eastern wing. Somewhere in this city, right now, a dozen conversations were happening that affected the shape of the next several years. She had spent 6 years participating in those conversations indirectly, filtering her contributions through a husband who rarely understood what she was doing. She was going to have to get used to being the thing that was visible. It was not, she understood, going to be comfortable. A woman stepping into the light always made people uneasy. especially when she was stepping into a light they had assumed was someone else's. There would be questions. There would be the particular hostility of people who felt her existence as a rebuke to conclusions they had drawn comfortably. There would be Rowan, who was going to find out, eventually, the full dimensions of what he had discarded. And she had no clear view yet of what he would do with that information. She thought about his face that morning, about the brief flicker of something before his expression closed. She had read it in the moment as difficulty, as the residue of a man who still had the capacity to feel the wrongness of what he was doing. She thought now that she might have been more generous in that reading than the evidence warranted. She thought the flicker might simply have been calculation, the momentary computation of a man who was checking one final time whether what he was about to do made strategic sense. He had concluded it did. He was going to discover, in the coming weeks and months, exactly how poorly he had calculated. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She noticed the absence of satisfaction carefully, the way she noticed most things about her own interior landscape. What she felt was something more neutral and more durable, a kind of readiness, the particular quality of attention that comes to a person who has been waiting for a specific moment without quite admitting to themselves that they were waiting. She had been waiting for permission. She understood that now, with the city spread below her and the Valamont seal in her pocket and 7 letters going out into the night. 6 years of doing extraordinary things in someone else's name because she had not yet given herself permission to do them in her own. Rowan had given her something this morning in that sterile drawing room with his solicitor and his pregnant mistress and his carefully prepared document. He had given her the end of the waiting. She ought to send him a note of thanks. She almost smiled at the thought, and then she went to bed and she slept without difficulty, which told her everything she needed to know about whether she had been living the right life. She was at her writing desk at 6:30 the next morning, correspondence already in progress, when Perths knocked and entered with a note on a silver tray. It had arrived, he said, in the small hours, hand-delivered by a rider who had not waited for reply. She opened it. It was from Octavia Marand, not in response to her letter of yesterday, which had not yet had time to arrive, but clearly prompted by information that had traveled faster than the post. The Blackthorn household has been in contact with Lord Pembridge this morning, the note read, Octavia's handwriting small and rapid, the sentences stripped to their useful minimum. Pembridge is asking questions about the Aldermere River Corridor Agreement. He appears to believe the negotiation is now open. You should know that 3 other families have been notified of an investment meeting at Blackthorn House next week. Whatever you have been maintaining, they are no longer sure it is maintained. Move quickly if you intend to. Serafina read the note twice. She set it down. She had been awake for 40 minutes. She had been gone from Blackthorn House for less than 24 hours. She looked at the unfinished letter in front of her, the one that would become the next stage of what she now understood she was building. And then she looked at the window, where the morning was gray and just beginning. They were already circling, which meant she had less time than she had thought, which meant the 7 letters she had sent yesterday were not enough. They were a beginning, but the architecture she needed to rebuild was going to require more than letters. She was going to have to appear, in person, in the rooms where power was actually distributed, under her own name and without the buffer of a husband's title to make her presence explicable. She was going to have to let them see her. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to stop being the thing behind the wall and become the wall itself, the exposure of it, the irreversibility, the way that, once certain truths became visible, they could not be made invisible again. Then she picked up her pen. She had a letter to finish, and after the letter she had to dress for a visit to the Merchant Exchange, where a man named Harwick Belson had been managing a Valamont financial instrument for 4 years without knowing who had set it up. She was going to introduce herself. She was going to watch his face when she did. And then, the knock at her door was not Perth's. She knew this because Perth's had a specific knock developed over decades of knowing how to interrupt people who needed to be interrupted without causing them to feel interrupted. This knock was sharp, impatient, and entirely unannounced. She rose from the desk. She opened the door. The man standing in the corridor was not anyone she knew. He was dressed in the livery of the royal household, not a servant's livery, but the more specific, less decorated uniform of a royal correspondence officer. He was young, perhaps 25, and he was holding a letter sealed in red with an impression she recognized from very far away in her memory, the Voss family crest. "Lady Serafina Valamont?" he said. It was the first time anyone official had called her that, the first time anyone official had demonstrated that they knew it was accurate. "Yes," she said. "His Highness Prince Aldrich Voss requests your presence at Voss House at noon today." The officer paused, and she could see him reading her face, or trying to. "He says to tell you that the matter of the Aldermere corridor is now a royal interest, and that you should not—" He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, looked back up. "That you should not come alone." Serafina looked at the letter in his hand. She did not take it. "Tell His Highness," she said, "that I'll be there at noon, and that I am never alone." She closed the door. She stood in the center of her room for a moment, in the morning quiet, in the light that was just beginning to warm the city outside her window. She could feel the pieces of something enormous beginning to move, feel it the way you feel the first tremor of something structural, something below the ordinary earth, something that has been building for a long time in the dark. Rowan Blackthorne, at this precise moment, was sitting down to breakfast in the house she had left yesterday morning. He was reading his correspondence, or he was talking to Vivian, or he was looking at the Aldermere mineral rights documents and beginning to notice the particular problem of understanding something you have never had to understand before. He was a man who had made a calculation and was now living in the first hour of its consequences. He had no idea what he had discarded. He would. The Royal Correspondence Officer was still standing in the corridor when Serafina turned back to her desk. She knew this because she could hear him, the small, uncertain sounds of a young man who had delivered his message and received an answer that did not fit the protocol he had been given. He had expected, she supposed, either deference or questions. He had received neither. She heard him shift his weight once, twice, and then his footsteps moved away down the hall, and the Meridian Club returned to its particular morning quiet. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She finished the letter to Lord Creswell Hartley in 11 minutes, sealed it, and added it to the stack that Perths would dispatch with the Morning Post. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and did what she almost never permitted herself to do. She thought about the cost. Not the cost of leaving. She had made her accounting of that in the carriage yesterday and found it manageable. The cost of what came next. The particular exposure of a woman who has arranged her life around being useful in the dark and must now learn to be powerful in the light. There was a violence to that transition that no amount of preparation fully absorbed. You could know, intellectually, that you were capable of a thing and still feel the cold of it when the moment arrived. She felt the cold now. She noted it, the way she noted most things about herself, without judgment, with precision, and then she stood up and began to dress for Voss House. Octavia Marand arrived at the Meridian Club at 9:30, which was 30 minutes after Serafina had sent a one-line note asking her to come. This was notable because Octavia's office was 20 minutes away. She had not wasted time. She was a woman in her mid-40s, Octavia, with the dense stillness of someone who had spent decades deciding which parts of herself to show in any given room. She wore her graying hair short and her clothing in colors that did not ask for attention. She sat across from Serafina in the sweet small sitting area and looked at her with the particular quality of attention that had made Serafina trust her, years ago, above everyone else. She was looking at the actual situation, not at what she hoped the situation was. "How bad?" Serafina said. Pembridge moved fast. Octavia set a leather-bound folder on the table between them. "He contacted 3 investors in the Aldermere corridor before 8 this morning. 2 of them responded immediately. The third, Harwick Belson, did not respond, which either means he's loyal or he's waiting to see which way the river runs. Belson is cautious, not disloyal. Then you need to talk to him before Pembridge does." Octavia's eyes moved briefly to the folder and back. "There's something else. The Blackthorne household sent a formal communication to the Hartley estate last night. Not Rowan directly. It came from Lord Aldrich's office. The solicitor." Serafina considered this. "What did it say?" "I don't have the text, but the Hartley estate wrote back, and they copied the response to Lord Pembridge." Octavia paused. They are testing whether the corridor agreement holds without your involvement. They don't know yet that it doesn't hold without your involvement because you built it, and they're about to find out. How long? The meeting at Blackthorn House is scheduled for Thursday. That's 6 days. Octavia looked at her steadily. Serafina, how much of what you were managing passes with you? The question sat between them like a piece of furniture being moved into a room where there was no obvious place for it. Most of it, Serafina said. Octavia exhaled. It was not dramatic. It was the exhale of a woman recalibrating a numerical estimate. Then Thursday becomes a problem. Thursday becomes an opportunity. Serafina picked up the folder and opened it. The first page was a financial summary she had not asked for, which meant Octavia had prepared it before receiving her note, which meant Octavia had been paying attention to the Blackthorn situation for some time and had simply been waiting to be useful. She looked at the numbers. They were, as she had suspected, more favorable than anyone currently understood. If Rowan's investors arrive Thursday expecting business as usual and find instead that the architecture holding that business together has relocated itself, then the meeting does my work for me. That assumes you don't intend to let Rowan rebuild. I intend to let Rowan try, she said. There is a difference. Octavia was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city made its various sounds, cartwheels, voices, the distant rhythm of the exchange district beginning its day. The Voss note, Octavia said. What does he want? The Aldermere corridor, most likely. If Pembridge is moving on it, Voss knows. And Voss has been positioning for Southern trade access for 2 years. She closed the folder. He wants to know if I'm an independent party now. He wants to know what terms I'm operating under. And what terms are you operating under? Serafina looked at her. My own. God. Voss House stood on the northern edge of the city's diplomatic quarter, where the streets were wider and the buildings carried the particular self-assurance of architecture that expects to be looked at. It was not the largest house in the quarter, but it was the most deliberate. Every window placed to maximize light and minimize exposure. Every entrance positioned with the understanding that who entered and from which direction told you exactly what the visit was about. Serafina arrived at noon through the eastern entrance, which was the one used for private consultations rather than official ones. This had been Prince Aldrich's specification, conveyed through the correspondence officer. She noted it and understood it. He was not treating this as a court visit. He was treating it as a conversation between parties who had not yet determined their relationship. She was shown into a library on the second floor, a room she had never been in, though she had been to Voss House twice before, both times in her capacity as the Duchess of Blackthorn, both times for functions where the nature of her presence was entirely decorative. The library was a working room, stacked with paper, with opened books weighted at the spine, with the organized density of a space where someone actually thought rather than entertained. Prince Aldrich Voss was 34 years old, and he was standing at the center window when she entered, and he turned as she did, and he looked at her with an expression she had seen on very few faces in her life. The expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific meeting and is now deciding in real time whether the reality of the person matches the idea. Lady Vallemont, he said. Your Highness. Sit, please. He gestured toward 2 chairs arranged near the fireplace and moved toward one of them without the performative courtliness of men who use manners as a power instrument. He sat because he was going to sit, and he expected her to make her own decision about what she was going to do. She sat. He was not a conventionally impressive man. Medium height, lean, with dark eyes that moved quickly between subjects and a mouth held in the particular compression of someone who had learned, possibly early and possibly painfully, that speaking first cost you information. He was the king's second cousin, which meant he had precisely enough royal proximity to have significant influence and precisely little enough to have escaped the particular damage that came with being first in line. The Aldermere corridor, he said. You mentioned in your note that it was a royal interest. It became one this morning, when Pembridge made his inquiries. His eyes held hers with a directness that was neither aggressive nor apologetic. Lord Pembridge has been trying to break the Aldermere agreement for 18 months. He has not been able to because the coalition holding it together was unusually coherent. He is now operating on the assumption that the coalition has fractured. A pause. He appears to believe that the Duchess of Blackthorn's departure from the ducal household is equivalent to the departure of whatever held those relationships in place. He is correct, she said. Aldrich looked at her. Something in him settled, fractionally, in the way of a man who has been given an answer that matches what he calculated but had not been certain he would receive. How much of it transfers? All of it, if I choose to transfer it. She let that sit for a beat. The question is where? I'm listening. She studied him for a moment. The posture of him, the patience in it, the particular quality of a man who had resources and knew how to wait. Her note of yesterday had been careful, deliberately ambiguous, offering enough to suggest what she could do without specifying terms. He had summoned her in response. That sequence told her he was not operating from a position of confidence, but from one of genuine interest, which was the only position from which serious arrangements could be made. The Aldermere corridor represents approximately 12% of the southern trade flow through Blackthorn territory, she said. The agreement as currently structured has 4 years remaining and 2 renewal provisions. The parties holding it are not loyal to the Blackthorn name. They are loyal to the relationships through which the agreement was established. She paused. Those relationships are mine. What do you want? Aldrich said. No preamble, no negotiating cushion. She had expected that from him, or had hoped for it, and the absence of theater in him made the conversation easier and more dangerous simultaneously. I want the Valemont claim on the Thorngate properties restored through the court's property division office, she said. The claim has been suspended for 11 years on a procedural technicality my father's solicitors allowed to stand. It is legally sound and would take approximately 3 weeks to restore with the right pressure applied. And in exchange, the Aldermere parties maintain the agreement. Pembridge does not get his opening. The southern trade corridor remains coherent. She watched him. And you gain a direct line to whatever I build next, at terms we determine separately. Aldrich was quiet. The fire made small sounds. Outside the window, the diplomatic quarter went about its business. The Thorngate properties, he said, are currently the subject of a dispute between 3 families, one of which has a standing relationship with the King's Senior Council. I know. It will create friction. Yes. She met his eyes. Do you want the corridor or not? He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Not his position, his understanding of her. She watched him do it, and did not help him. I'll need 3 days to move the property claim through the right offices, he said. I'll need 2 to secure the parties' confirmation of their intentions. She stood. Send the documentation to the Meridian Club when it's ready. She had reached the door of the library before he spoke again. Lady Valemont. She turned. He was still seated, still in the posture of a man at rest, but his eyes had the quality of someone arriving at the actual question. How long have you been planning this? She thought about the honest answer, about 6 years of letters and relationships and corridors of influence maintained in someone else's name, about a seal carried in a personal case for 6 years, unused, because she had not yet given herself permission. I've been ready for longer than I've been planning, she said. She left him with that. The Blackthorn household received its first significant defection on Tuesday, 4 days after Serafina walked out of the East drawing room. A banking consortium that had held a Blackthorn note for 3 years sent a formal communication to Lord Aldrich's office requesting renegotiation of terms. The note cited changing market conditions, which was the polite fiction these things traveled under. The actual reason, which Serafina learned through Octavia by Wednesday morning, was that the consortium's senior partner had received a very brief, very courteous letter from a woman he had not heard from in 6 months, and the letter had reminded him, in the most genteel possible language, of several things she had done for him and had never called in. He called them in now. Serafina did not celebrate this. She was not in the business of celebrating yet. She was in the business of moving, which was a different state entirely, less about satisfaction and more about the particular metabolism of a person who has opened a valve after years of pressure and cannot yet afford to stop. She met with Harwick Belson on Wednesday afternoon in the offices of a merchant firm on the Exchange District's 2nd Street. Belson was 60, thick through the middle, with the direct manner of a man who had earned his money by being accurate about things rather than charming about them. He looked at her across a plain desk in a plain room and said, "I was wondering when you'd come in person." "You knew." "I didn't know specifically." He shrugged, which on his frame was an event. But someone was managing that Valamont instrument with a sophistication that didn't match the instruction profile I was given. I filed it under the interesting account and left it alone. He looked at her. "You're not actually Ashbourne." "I am Ashbourne on my mother's side. It's a legal name." "Valamont is the name that matters." He said it without drama, which she appreciated. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if you've spoken to Pembridge." "He reached out Monday. I didn't respond." Belson's expression moved through something brief and dry. "Pembridge has been trying to dismantle the southern corridor for a year and a half. Whatever he's building in place of it would benefit him specifically, and a very small number of people adjacent to him. I have no interest in that." He paused. "What are you building?" "Something that will benefit the parties in the corridor and anyone intelligent enough to position themselves alongside it in the next 6 months." "That's a diplomat's answer." "It's the accurate one. I don't have the full structure yet. I have the foundation." Belson looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality she had noticed over 4 years of indirect correspondence, of a man who made decisions the same way he counted money, without sentiment, without performance, just the reliable application of an accurate eye. "The Blackthorn name is going to have trouble by Thursday," he said. "Yes." "You knew that when you left." "I knew it before I left." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has received a piece of information that improves his understanding of a situation he had already found interesting. "All right," he said. "I'm in. Tell me what you need first." Bosant. Thursday arrived. At Blackthorn House, a meeting of investors, allies, and creditors had been assembled in the formal dining room, which was the room Rowan used when he wanted to demonstrate that he was the largest presence in any given space. Serafina knew this because Dorothea, who had remained at the house and who had sent a brief, careful note on Wednesday evening, described it in 3 sentences that contained between them everything Serafina needed to know. She did not attend. She did not need to attend. She was at the Meridian Club in her rooms conducting the morning's correspondence when the meeting at Blackthorn House began to unravel. She knew it was unraveling because the letters started arriving at 11:30. The first was from Lord Creswell Hartley, written in the cramped, rapid hand of a man composing while standing up. He had arrived at the Blackthorn meeting expecting to finalize the Aldermere corridor renewal and had discovered instead that the renewal terms he had negotiated were apparently unknown to anyone in the Blackthorn household. He had asked, in front of the assembled room, who had managed the prior negotiation. No one had been able to answer him. He was writing to ask if Lady Valamont, he had used her actual name, she noted, which meant the information had traveled faster than she had tracked, would be willing to clarify her current role in the matter. The second letter arrived 20 minutes later from one of the merchant consortium members who had been at the Blackthorn meeting. It was shorter and more direct. He wanted to know if the corridor agreement was still operable, and if so, under whose auspices. The third letter was not a letter. It was Dorothea, arriving at the Meridian Club in person, slightly breathless, with her coat still buttoned from the outside air. She knocked and entered and stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who has witnessed something she does not quite have the vocabulary to describe. "His Grace," she said. "He asked for you." Serafina set down her pen. "He asked for me at the meeting. He asked where you were, when he couldn't explain the Hartley terms. Lord Pembridge said something. I couldn't hear exactly. And His Grace—" Dorothea stopped, collected herself. "He said your name, in front of everyone. He said—" She paused again, and in the pause there was something that was not quite sorrow and not quite satisfaction. The complicated emotion of someone watching a thing they had predicted come true. "He said he needed to speak with the Duchess." The Duchess. Not Lady Serafina. Not his wife. The Duchess. As though the title could summon the function even when the person who performed the function had walked out of the front door 4 days ago. Serafina looked at the window for a moment, at the morning light on the city. "Tell him," she said, "that the Duchess is unavailable." Dorothea hesitated. He seemed quite... Dorothea. Yes, Your Grace. Tell him the Duchess is unavailable, and then come back here, because I'm going to need someone who knows that house's schedule for the next 3 weeks. Dorothea left. Serafina turned back to her correspondence. There were 4 more letters requiring responses before noon, and Prince Aldrich's documentation on the Thorngate property claim had arrived that morning and needed review, and she was due to meet Octavia at the Exchange District office at 3 o'clock to finalize the consortium positioning. She had a great deal of work to do. She was 3 letters in when the knock came. Different from Perth's, different from Dorothea, sharp in the particular way of someone who is doing it with more force than necessary and knows it. She crossed to the door and opened it. Rowan Blackthorne was standing in the corridor of the Meridian Club. He was still in his formal clothes from the meeting. Dark wool, precisely tailored, the Blackthorne crest at his lapel. He was not composed. His jaw was set in the way she had seen it set in the drawing room 4 days ago, but underneath that, around his eyes, was something rawer, the specific quality of a man who has just stood in a room full of people he needed to impress and discovered that he did not know how to do it without tools he had not realized were tools. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something you have misjudged the dimensions of. "You need to come back," he said. She looked at him. "The Hartley Agreement, the Aldermere terms. No one in the house knows the terms, Serafina. Pembridge is using it. I need you to... You need me to what, Rowan?" His jaw tightened. "To come back and explain what you were managing, and how, and who the parties are." He paused. "Temporarily. Until we can put someone in place who can do what I do." He stopped. The corridor was narrow, and there was no one else in it, and the silence between them had the particular density of a silence that contains all the sentences that were never said across 6 years of a functional, loveless, carefully maintained marriage. She looked at him the way she had looked at the morning city from the carriage 4 days ago. Not with anger, not with grief, but with the clear, cold vision of a woman seeing something exactly as it is, rather than as it was supposed to be. "You didn't know," she said, "what I was doing. You didn't know the names or the terms or the relationships or the history of any of it. You took the results of it as evidence of your own position, and you never asked where the results came from." "Serafina, I'm not angry about that, Rowan. I want to be precise about this. I'm not angry." She held his eyes. "I'm saying it plainly so that what I say next is clear. I am not coming back. Not temporarily, not to explain, not for any terms you are currently in a position to offer." She paused. "The Aldermere corridor will hold or it won't, and the outcome of that has nothing to do with decisions you make now." His face changed. The tightness in his jaw became something else. Not softness. Rowan Blackthorne did not do softness, but a kind of thinning, the surface of a man whose calculation has returned an answer he wasn't prepared for. "You're going to let it fall apart," he said. You're going to let everything fall apart to prove a point." She shook her head. "I'm going to let it fall apart," she said, "because it was never yours to begin with." She closed the door. She stood in the center of the room for 30 seconds. She could hear him in the corridor. One moment of absolute stillness, and then his footsteps, sharp and even, moving away toward the stairs. She listened until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down at her desk. Her hands were perfectly steady. She picked up her pen. She finished the 4th letter, sealed it, started the 5th. She was deep into the 5th when the thought arrived, quiet and certain as a key turning in a lock. He would go home now, and he would tell Vivian what had happened, and Vivian would tell him what to do, and what Vivian would tell him to do would be exactly the wrong thing, because Vivian was a woman who understood how to take space but not how to hold it, who understood how to displace someone but not how to replace what they did, and the next several weeks were going to demonstrate that distinction in ways that Rowan would not enjoy. Serafina wrote the letter. Below her window, a carriage moved through Clarendon Street at the pace of a man who had somewhere to be. She did not look up. The Thorngate documentation was waiting on her left. The Exchange District meeting at 3. The consortium. The corridor. The 7 threads she had already set in motion, and the 3 more she was going to set in motion before the week was out, all of them moving in the same direction, all of them gathering weight the way water gathered weight, quietly and inevitably, until the moment arrived when the weight became the thing itself. She had one more letter to write, not one she had planned, one that had just become necessary. It was to Lord Pembridge. It was very short. It said, in the most courteous possible language, she was aware of his interest in the Aldermere corridor. She would be happy to discuss the matter at his earliest convenience. She had something she believed he would find clarifying. She sealed it. She set it on the stack for Perth. She was done waiting. She was done being the thing behind the wall. What she was now was the wall, the foundation, and everything built on top of it. And the man who had decided she was replaceable was about to stand in the rubble of that decision and finally completely understand what he had done. The letter to Lord Pembridge went out on Thursday evening. By Friday morning, he had not responded. Serafina noted the silence and filed it under things that would clarify themselves shortly. Pembridge was a man who used response time as a negotiating instrument. She had observed this across 3 years of watching him operate in the peripheral spaces of Blackthorn affairs. And his silence meant either that he was deciding or that he already had decided and was arranging something before he replied. She could not yet determine which. She set the question aside and continued working. The Thorngate documentation from Aldrich required 2 hours of careful review and produced at the end of those 2 hours 4 clarifying questions she sent back through the same discreet channel. Octavia arrived at the Meridian Club at noon with updated consortium figures and the information that Belson had moved, quietly and efficiently, to secure the 2 corridor parties that Pembridge had approached on Monday. Both had confirmed their intentions. The Aldermere agreement was, for the moment, intact. For the moment. She ate lunch at her desk. She was drafting a letter to Garrison Fell, the first in which she used her full name without code, the first that gave him explicit instruction to begin the restoration of the Valamon estate's active operations. When Perth knocked and entered with the expression he reserved for information he had not been asked to gather, but had gathered anyway, because he understood what she needed better than she had specified. Lord Pembridge's secretary, he said, has been making inquiries this morning about the Meridian Club's membership roster. She looked up from the letter. Which inquiries? Whether a Lady Ashbourne holds membership here, whether she has rooms here currently. Perth's face was its usual diplomatic surface. I informed them that our membership records are private. What name did they use when asking? Ashbourne. He paused. Not Valamont. She set down her pen. Pembridge was not responding to her letter because he did not yet understand who he was dealing with. He was still operating on the Blackthorn framework, still treating her as the Duchess's wife, as the Ashbourne woman, as whatever he had filed her under in the years she had been managing things. He had no idea she was managing. He had received her letter and had concluded he was being approached by a displaced aristocratic wife who was attempting to leverage her social connections from a position of considerable weakness. He had not done his research. That gave her, she calculated, approximately 48 hours before someone told him what he needed to know. Possibly less. Perce, she said, I need a carriage in 20 minutes, and I need you to send a note to Lord Pembridge's office, not his secretary, his office, that Lady Valamont will receive him at 3 o'clock this afternoon if he wishes to discuss the Aldermere matter. Use the Valamont seal. Perth did not react to the name. He had known it since she walked in 4 days ago. I'll see to it, he said, and left. She finished the letter to Garrison Fell. She put on her coat. She went out into the city to do the thing she had been delaying since Thursday morning because she had wanted the consortium positioned and the Thorngate documentation reviewed and the Hartley confirmation received before she did it. She went to see Octavia's contact at the Patent and Estates office, the woman whose name was Marin Holst and who had been, over 18 months of careful correspondence, the closest thing Serafina had to an operational ally inside the city's legal infrastructure. She needed Marin Holst to do something that could not be done through letters. Pembridge arrived at 3:45, which was 45 minutes late, and therefore a statement. He was a large man, Lord Aldous Pembridge, with the kind of physical confidence that had probably been earned in youth and maintained since through the simple fact that most people moved out of his way. He was perhaps 60, with white hair and a face that had been handsome and was now authoritative, and he wore his clothing with the ease of a man who has never needed to calculate the impression he was making. He walked into the Meridian Club's private meeting room, which Serafina had arranged for the afternoon, which was a room she had used twice before for exactly this category of conversation, and he looked at her, and his face did the thing faces did when they encountered something that did not match their expectation. He had expected, she knew, the Ashbourne woman. Something smaller, perhaps. Something that could be managed. She was standing at the window when he entered, and she let him have the moment of recalibration without helping him through it. "Lady Vallemont," he said finally. "Lord Pembridge." She gestured to the chair across from hers. "Sit, please." He sat, but he did it the way men of his particular variety sat. Forward, elbows on the arms of the chair, weight distributed in a way that communicated he could be upright and moving in a very short time. He looked at her across the small table with the expression of a man who has arrived at a meeting believing he holds the advantage and is now quietly reviewing that belief. "I received your note," he said. "I know. That's why you're here." His mouth tightened briefly. "You've been managing the Aldermere corridor." "Among other things." "For how long?" 7 years. She watched him do the arithmetic. She watched him arrive at the number and then recalculate it against the timeline of his own maneuvering and understand, with the particular sourness of a man whose plan has just been reframed, that he had been trying to dismantle something for 18 months that had been built, specifically and intelligently, across a period 4 times that long. The Hartley relationship goes back 8 years, she added, because she wanted him to have the full picture. The consortium instrument was established 9. Pembridge said nothing for a moment. The room had a quality of pressure in it that she recognized, the pressure of a conversation where neither party is saying the most important thing yet, and both parties know it. "What do you want?" he said. "I want to understand what you're building," she said, "because if what you're building in place of the current corridor structure is actually better, for the parties, for the southern trade flow, for the people the corridor serves, then I have no particular attachment to what I built. I built it to function. If you have something that functions better, I'd like to know." He stared at her. It was not the response he had prepared for, and the fact of its being genuine. She meant it. She had meant it when she wrote the letter. She had no tribal attachment to the architecture she had built, only to what it accomplished seemed to confuse him more thoroughly than hostility would have. "You're serious," he said. "I'm always serious." He leaned back slightly, the first real movement he had made since sitting down. He was recalibrating again, and this time the recalibration was deeper, not just of her position, but of his understanding of the situation he had walked into. "What I'm building," he said slowly, "would benefit the northern investors primarily. The southern parties would retain access, but at modified terms." "Modified how?" "Extraction rates. The northern consortium would hold controlling interest in the mineral rights division. So the southern parties would be minority stakeholders in a corridor they currently control. They would be compensated. They would be displaced." She said it without heat, "and they would know it, which is why 2 of them did not respond to your Monday outreach." She paused. "What you're building is a restructuring that benefits Pembridge interests and a small number of northern investors. The current structure benefits 14 parties across 3 provinces. Those are different things." His jaw set. "The current structure is dependent on relationships that are no longer in Blackthorn hands," she said. "That's what you were going to say." A silence. "They were never in Blackthorn hands," she said. "That is what I'm telling you. The relationships are mine. They have always been mine. The Blackthorn name was a housing for them, not a source of them." She watched something move through his face, something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but was adjacent to both. "So if you want to restructure the corridor, Lord Pembridge, you need to have this conversation with me. Not with Rowan Blackthorn, not with his solicitor, with me." Pembridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, what would it take for you to support a restructuring?" She had the answer ready. She had had it ready since she had written the letter. She gave it to him in 6 sentences, clean and precise, and she watched his expression move through calculation, and she watched him arrive at the place where the numbers worked for enough parties that he could build a coalition around them, and she watched him decide. "I'll need 2 weeks," he said. "You have 10 days," she said. "After that, the Hartley renewal moves forward under the current terms and the window closes." He stood. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 60 years developing a certain map of how power is distributed and has just discovered a significant feature that was not on it. "I should have been dealing with you from the beginning," he said. It was not an apology. It was a recalibration stated aloud. "Yes," she said. "You should have." No. He left at 4:15. She sat in the meeting room for 10 minutes after he was gone, alone with the afternoon light and the particular quality of stillness that followed a conversation that had gone exactly as intended. She was not satisfied. She noted that carefully, the absence of satisfaction, the thing that should have been there and was not. What she felt instead was the low, steady hum of forward motion, which was becoming so familiar it was almost indistinguishable from her resting state. She was gathering her papers when Perths appeared in the doorway. His face was different. It was the face she had seen on him perhaps twice in 4 years of intermittent visits to the Meridian Club. The face of a man who is delivering something he wishes he did not have to deliver. "There is a woman downstairs," he said. "She does not have an appointment. She says her name is Maren Holst." Serafina went still. Maren Holst was not supposed to come to the Meridian Club. Maren Holst had a protocol, 3 years of established protocol, and that protocol did not involve appearing in person unannounced. That protocol existed specifically because Maren Holst's position at the Patent and Estates Office made her presence anywhere near Serafina a potential liability for both of them. "Send her up," she said. Maren Holst was 40, angular, with a practical face, and the kind of eyes that moved constantly between potential points of interest, which was a professional habit so deeply ingrained it had become physical. She came into the room quickly, and she shut the door herself, and she looked at Serafina with an expression that Serafina had never seen on her before. "The Thorngate documentation," Maren said. "What about it?" "Someone flagged it this morning, at the Property Division office." She stopped, started again. "Someone internal. Someone who knew which desk it was on and what name it was filed under." Her voice was controlled, but underneath it was the vibration of a woman who has just discovered that her professional environment contains a threat she did not anticipate. They pulled the file before the review could be completed, and they sent a copy to Blackthorn House. The room became very quiet. Serafina set her papers down on the table. She did this carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are doing something your mind has not caught up to yet. She looked at Maren Holst's face, and she read it the way she had learned to read everything, precisely, without the interference of what she wanted to be there. "Who?" she said. "I don't know yet. Someone with access to the review queue, which narrows it to 4 people." Maren paused. "Serafina, if the file went to Blackthorn House, they know about the Thorngate claim. They know you're pursuing it, and they know that Aldrich is supporting it," she said. The words sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in all directions simultaneously. She understood, in the 3 seconds that followed, the full geometry of what had happened. The Thorngate file had not been flagged by accident. Someone at the Patent and Estates Office had been watching for exactly this kind of movement. Watching for Valamont activity, for Aldrich-adjacent transactions, for the specific signature of what she had been building, and had moved the moment the documentation appeared, which meant someone had known to watch, which meant someone had told them what to watch for, which meant the leak had not come from the estate's office. She thought about who knew. Octavia, Belson, Maren, Perths, Aldrich himself, and whoever Aldrich had trusted with the task of preparing the documentation. She thought about 48 hours. The window she had calculated before Pembridge learned who he was dealing with. The window that was now irrelevant because someone had given Blackthorn House something far more dangerous than Pembridge's research could have produced. "How much was in the file?" she said. "The claim itself. The supporting documentation establishing Valamont lineage and property rights." Maren's voice went careful. "And the correspondence establishing Aldrich's involvement." Serafina turned to the window. Outside, the city was moving into the late afternoon. The specific light of 4:30 in the city, amber and long, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen through glass. She looked at it, and she thought with the rapid, flat efficiency of a person who has been trained by years of managing crises she was never supposed to be visible in. Rowan had the file. Rowan knew about the Thorngate claim. Rowan knew about Aldrich. And Rowan, who was not, for all his faults, a stupid man, would understand immediately what the Thorngate claim meant. Not just the property, the full statement of it, that she was not who he had married, that the woman he had housed and utilized and discarded was the sole heir to a family whose resources and connections were not comparable to the Blackthorn legacy, but superior to it. And then the second understanding would arrive, and that one would be worse, that every advantage the Blackthorn family had accumulated in the last 6 years had been built on a foundation he had not known he was standing on, and that foundation had walked out of his house 8 days ago. She thought about Rowan in that formal dining room on Thursday, about the Hartley question he couldn't answer, about calling for the Duchess, about arriving at the Meridian Club with his jaw set and his eyes raw and saying, "You need to come back," in the tone of a man who still believed the problem was administrative. He no longer believed that. "Marin," she said, still looking out the window. "Yes?" "Can you find out who flagged it?" "I can try. It will take time and it will require me to be careful." "Be careful." She turned from the window. "And Marin, the file that went to Blackthorn House, was it complete?" Marin hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I mean, was there anything in it beyond what you told me?" Another hesitation, smaller, and in that smallness was the thing Serafina had already suspected was there, the thing Marin had not led with, the thing she had been building toward, the thing she had come here in person to say because she could not put it in a letter. "There was a summary document," Marin said, "attached to the Valamont lineage records." She stopped. "It was not something I included. I don't know where it came from. It was already in the file when I reviewed it this morning." "What did it say?" Marin looked at the floor briefly, looked back. "It was a private correspondence record. Letters between you and Prince Aldrich, going back 14 months. Her voice had dropped to the register of someone delivering something that required physical steadiness to say. It made the nature of the relationship appear. It framed it as what? "As personal," Marin said, "rather than political." The silence that followed was the longest of the day. Serafina stood in it. She let it be the size it was. She felt the cold she had felt that first morning in the Meridian Club, the edge of a transition, the sharpness of something irreversible. And this time it was not the clean cold of freedom, but something more complicated, something with weight and temperature both, the cold of standing in a room where the walls have just moved closer. The letters between herself and Aldrich were political. They were careful and precise and conducted with the specific rigor of two people who understood exactly what they were doing and what it was for. She knew this. Aldrich knew this. But letters stripped of context, cut selectively, presented to a man whose instinct was to find the most damaging possible reading of anything that concerned his family name. Letters could be made to say almost anything. And Rowan now had 14 months of them. She thought about who had put the summary document in the file. Who had the access, who had known about the correspondence, who had understood precisely what the most damaging possible deployment of that information would be. She thought about a woman in a cream morning dress standing near a fireplace, a woman who had been in Blackthorn House for 8 months, a woman who had watched Serafina walk out of that house and had concluded, perhaps, that the threat had departed with her, a woman who had then watched the Thursday meeting collapse and had understood, more quickly than Rowan, and with clearer eyes, that the threat had not departed at all, that it had simply changed location. Vivian Hale had not spent 8 months in Blackthorn House being decorative. She had spent 8 months learning where the files were. Serafina looked at Marin Holst and she felt something shift in her chest. Not break, not collapse, but shift. The way the ground shifts before it decides what it's going to do. She felt the specific quality of a plan that has been built with precision, encountering a variable she had underweighted. She had assessed Vivian as a woman who understood displacement but not replacement. She had been wrong. Vivian understood exactly enough to be dangerous, and the specific kind of danger she posed, the intimate interior kind, the kind that came from proximity and patience, was the kind Serafina had not prepared for because she had spent 6 years underestimating what happened behind her back in her own house. That error was going to cost her something. She did not yet know how much. "Go back to the office," she said. "Find out who flagged the file. Tell no one what you've told me." She held Marin's eyes. "And Marin, thank you for coming." Marin nodded once, gathered herself with the efficiency of a woman who manages difficult things as a professional condition, and left. Serafina stood alone in the meeting room. The amber light had moved while she wasn't watching and was now lower, longer, the last of the afternoon going out of the city like something being slowly closed. She needed to contact Aldrich immediately. Before Rowan did, before someone at the palace did, before the letters became the story instead of the context they actually were. She needed Aldrich to know what was in the hands of a man who was currently deciding how much damage he was willing to do in order to reverse the consequences of his own choices. She also needed to think about Vivian. She had been thinking about Vivian as a secondary problem, the complicating factor, the ambitious woman whose schemes would eventually undo themselves, who needed only time and her own nature to produce her own exposure. That assessment had been accurate as far as it went. It had not gone far enough. Vivian had access to the interior of the Blackthorn household in ways that Serafina had not been willing to fully account for, perhaps because accounting for them required her to acknowledge that she had left things behind when she left that house. Not objects, not paper, but the accumulated material of 6 years of life, 6 years of correspondence, 6 years of being a person in a specific place. She had walked out with her dignity and her traveling coat and a half-finished letter. She had left behind a woman who had been watching her for 8 months and taking notes. The city outside the window was going dark at its edges now, the amber giving way to the bluish gray of early evening, the first lamps being lit in the streets below. Serafina looked at it, and she understood, with the flat, complete clarity of a woman who has just had the architecture of her situation substantially altered, that the next move was not the one she had planned. The next move was harder and more exposed and more final than anything she had intended to do this week. She had been building carefully, methodically, with the patience of a woman who understood that durable things were built slowly. She had been working in the dark, or at the edge of the light, moving carefully into visibility on her own terms and at her own pace. That pace had just been taken from her. Vivian Hale had taken it. And the letters now in Rowan Blackthorn's hands were a lit torch moving toward everything Serafina had spent 6 years building. And if she did not step fully into the light, not at her own pace, not on her own terms, but now, tonight, before Rowan moved, there would be nothing left to step into. She picked up her papers from the table. She had 2 hours before the palace's evening correspondence window closed. She was going to use them. She wrote the letter to Aldrich standing up. There was no time to sit, no time for the careful, measured composition she preferred, no time for the 3 drafts she typically produced before committing to something this consequential. She wrote it at the standing desk near the window of the Meridian Club meeting room with the last of the afternoon light failing around her and her hand moving faster than it usually moved, because fast was what the situation required, and she was done refusing to give situations what they required. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first told him what Marin had told her. The second told him what she intended to do about it, which was not a request for his approval, but a statement of fact delivered to a man she needed to be informed rather than surprised. She sealed it with the Valamont seal, flagged it for immediate delivery through Perth's most trusted runner, and was back in her rooms and at her writing desk before the ink was fully dry on the outside fold. She wrote 3 more letters in the following 90 minutes. All 3 went to parties in the Aldermere corridor. Not Hartley, not Belson, but the 3 she had not yet contacted directly, the 3 who were the structural center of the agreement and whose confirmation she had been planning to secure next week, at a pace appropriate to the situation she had been managing before Vivian Hale had rearranged the timeline. The letters were short and direct and used her actual name without qualification for the first time in years. They said, "You have been conducting business through relationships I established. You should know who you were actually dealing with, and you should know that those relationships remain intact and are now operating under their correct name." She sent them. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling of the Meridian Club suite for approximately 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, And then she looked back down at the desk and thought about the palace correspondence window and whether 2 hours was enough. It was not enough. It was what she had. Aldrich's response arrived at 8:45 in the evening, which was fast enough that he had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of message. It was 4 lines, and 3 of them were procedural. The 4th line said, "Come to Voss House tonight. Use the east entrance. Come alone." She was there by 9:30. He was in the library again, and this time he was not standing at the window but seated at the central desk with papers around him and his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm in the manner of a man who has been working for several hours without interruption. He looked up when she entered, and he looked at her face, and he said nothing for a moment, reading it. "How much?" he said. 14 months of correspondence, selective, I assume, framed to suggest a personal connection beyond the political. Aldrich was quiet. He had the quality, under pressure, of becoming more still rather than less. The stillness of someone whose response to threat was to reduce expenditure and increase precision. She watched him process the information and arrive at the same calculation she had arrived at in the meeting room 3 hours ago. "He'll take it to the King's Council," Aldrich said, "if he's intelligent about it." "He's not intelligent, he's desperate." He stood. "A desperate man takes it somewhere faster and louder. He takes it to the summit." The Royal Provincial Summit was in 11 days. It was the event she had known about since January. The event that had been the background clock of everything she had been building. The moment when the full weight of the aristocracy, the merchant class, and the crown's representatives would be in one room, when the architecture of power would be most visible and most vulnerable simultaneously. She had been planning to be present at the summit as Lady Valmont, formally and visibly, for the first time. She had been planning it as an arrival, a controlled introduction, the moment she chose to let the room see her. Rowan was going to try to use it as a trial. "He doesn't have enough to damage you formally," she said. "The letters are ambiguous at best. Selectively presented, but ambiguous. The Thorngate claim is legally sound, you said so yourself. He doesn't need enough to damage me formally." Aldrich looked at her directly. "He needs enough to create a story. At the summit, in that room, in front of every person whose opinion shapes the next 10 years, he doesn't need a verdict. He needs a question mark." She knew this. She had known it since Marin left the meeting room. A question mark over Aldrich's involvement with the sole heir of House Valmont, deployed at the right moment in the right room, could unravel in 2 minutes what had taken 14 months to build. It did not matter that the relationship was political. It did not matter that the letters, read in their full context, were models of professional discretion. Context was the first casualty of a well-timed accusation, and Rowan Blackthorne had just been handed a weapon he had not earned and did not fully understand. And the most dangerous thing in any conflict was a weapon in the hands of someone too injured to be careful about where he aimed it. "What do you want to do?" Aldrich said. "I want to go to the summit." That was already the plan. "I want to go differently." She looked at him steadily. "I want to go as what I am, not as an arrival, not as an introduction." She paused. "I want every person in that room to know who I am before Rowan opens his mouth." Aldrich held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation, the risk of it, the exposure, the fact that what she was proposing was the removal of every remaining buffer between her actual identity and the full weight of a room that had spent years forming opinions about her based on a name and a position that were real but incomplete. "That's a very different thing from what you planned," he said. "The plan changed. If you go in that room as Valmont, there is no going back. I know." She said it flatly, without drama. There was no going back the moment Vivian put those letters in that file. The only question now is whether I walk into what comes next, or whether it comes to find me. Aldrich looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it. "I'll have the Voss family documentation ready by the summit. Your Valmont lineage, the estate records, the full financial disclosure, everything that makes the picture clear before anyone else tries to make it cloudy. And the Thorngate claim. I'll push it through before Thursday." His eyes were steady. "Serafina, if this goes wrong at the summit, then it goes wrong in the most visible possible way," she said. and we deal with it from the light instead of from the dark. She left Voss House at 10 past 10 and rode back to the Meridian Club through streets that were nearly quiet, the city having settled into its late-night rhythms, and she sat in the corner of the carriage and looked at her hands in her lap and allowed herself, for the duration of the ride, to feel the full weight of what the next 11 days contained. Not fear exactly. She had made her accounting of fear the same way she made her accounting of everything else, and it came out manageable. But the particular gravity of a situation that has stopped being something you are managing and has become something you are inside of, something that has its own momentum now, its own direction, that will move whether you move with it or not. She had stopped managing Rowan's life 10 days ago. She had not yet fully started managing her own. The next 11 days were going to change that. The summit convened on a Thursday morning in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Royal Province House, a building Seraphina had attended 4 times as the Duchess of Blackthorn, always in the secondary position of a wife attending a husband's engagement, always in the particular invisibility of a woman whose competence was apparent to anyone paying attention, and therefore ignored by everyone who preferred not to pay attention. She arrived alone, which had been Aldrich's strong suggestion and her stronger preference. She wore deep charcoal again, the same color she had chosen the morning Rowan dismissed her, which was not sentimentality, but precision. The understanding that a person's visual signature mattered at moments like this, that walking into a room looking like the same woman who had walked out of Blackthorn House 2 weeks ago told a story more efficiently than any introduction. She wore the Valemont crest at her lapel, small and unambiguous. She wore her hair pinned the way she had pinned it herself that morning, her own hands, the same steadying act. She did not hurry through the entrance hall. She moved at the pace of someone who has arrived where she intended to be. The first person who saw her and understood what they were seeing was Lord Creswell Hartley, who was standing near the eastern corridor speaking to 2 men she recognized as Northern trade representatives. He looked at her, and he looked at her lapel, and his face did the specific thing faces did when a puzzle they had been working on for some time suddenly produced its solution. He excused himself from the conversation and crossed to her. "Lady Valemont," he said, and there was in his voice the particular quality of a man who has been conducting business with someone for 7 years and is only now meeting them. "Lord Hartley." She held out her hand. He took it. "I believe we have a renewal to finalize." "We do," he said, and then quietly, "I heard there may be some disruption this morning." "There may be," she said. "Stay close to the corridor parties. If anything is said about the Aldermere agreement today, I want you to be the first response." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has decided, in this precise moment, which side of something he is on. He moved away. She had spoken to 4 more people before the assembly doors opened. Belson, who had arrived early and was precisely where she expected him, anchored and immovable in the way of a man who has placed his bet and sees no reason to move from it. A woman named Councillor Ashby, who managed the Southern Provincial tax structure and who looked at Seraphina's lapel with the expression of someone receiving an answer to a question they had been asking for years, and 2 members of the Merchant Consortium whose names she had known for 4 years and whose faces she was seeing for the first time. By the time the assembly hall filled, she had spoken to 11 people. That was enough. Duchess. Rowan arrived with Lord Aldrich the solicitor, which was the first indication that he had formalized his position overnight, that he had moved from desperate to procedural, which was actually more dangerous. He looked across the assembly hall, and he found her immediately. Their eyes met across the crowd with the particular quality of 2 people who have been in proximity for 6 years and can locate each other in a room by some mechanism below conscious thought. And his face, for one unguarded second, did something complicated. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She let him see her standing where she was standing, in the coat he recognized with the crest he did not, and she let him understand what that meant, and she watched him understand it. Then she looked away first because she had other things to do. The assembly opened with procedural matters, the way these things always did. The organizational machinery of governance that existed to make power look like administration. She sat in the Valemont seat, which Aldrich had arranged with the assembly registrar on Monday, and she was aware of the room becoming aware of her in the particular way rooms became aware of things that did not match their expectation. She heard her name said twice in murmurs before the first hour was out. She did not respond to the murmurs. She waited. Rowan moved at the first recess. She saw him coming across the hall, and she saw Lord Aldrich, the solicitor, moving with him, and she saw Vivian, who had accompanied Rowan to the summit in the full formal capacity of his companion, which was its own statement, moving to a position near the east wall with the deliberate casualness of a woman placing herself where she can see without being seen. Seraphina stood where she was and let him come to her. He stopped 3 feet away. He had the particular compressed energy of a man who has spent 2 weeks watching things move in directions he did not anticipate and has arrived at the place where motion is no longer possible and only confrontation remains. "This ends today," he said. "What does?" "Whatever you're doing. Whatever you and Aldrich, Rowan." Her voice was not quiet. It was level. There were people within earshot, and he had clearly calculated that, had clearly decided the public quality of this moment was a weapon rather than a liability, and she met that calculation directly. "Say what you have to say." His jaw worked. "The letters are political correspondence between two parties with shared financial interests, which is what they are." She watched his face. "You know that. They can be made to look. They can be made to look like whatever a man with nothing left to lose decides to make them look like." She held his eyes. "Is that what you are now, Rowan? A man with nothing left to lose?" Something moved through him. She could see it. The specific movement of a person hitting the bottom of something and having to decide what they do from there. He had been a man with a plan 2 weeks ago. He had been a man with a document and a solicitor and a pregnant mistress and a calculation that had seemed sound in the privacy of the East drawing room. That calculation had been wrong in ways he was only now fully mapping, and the mapping was doing something to him that she recognized as pain, not the pain she would have wished on him, not the pain of consequence cleanly earned, but the ugly, compound pain of a man who does not yet understand what he is losing because he did not understand what he had. "You should have told me," he said. His voice had changed. The procedural edge had gone out of it, replaced by something rawer and less controlled, and she understood that Lord Aldrich, the solicitor standing nearby, was now witnessing something he had not been brought to witness. "When we married, you should have told me who you were." "I told you who I was," she said. "You decided it wasn't interesting enough to look at." His breath came short. "The Valamont was always there. Every letter I wrote in your name, every relationship I maintained, every deal that held, every alliance that didn't collapse, every creditor who gave you time when they shouldn't have." Her voice remained level, and it cost her something. That levelness cost her in the specific way that discipline always costs, drawn from a reserve that was not unlimited. "You didn't ask. Not once in 6 years did you ask me how any of it worked, who any of them were, what I was doing in the rooms you didn't go to. You took the results and you called them your position." "I didn't know?" "No." The word landed harder than she intended. "You didn't know because you didn't look, because it was easier to take what the wall gave you than to understand the wall." She stopped, held her breath for 1 beat, let it out. "I am not the wall anymore, Rowan." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the assembly hall moved through its recess patterns. Small groups, low conversations, the ambient sound of power in its social form. And in the middle of all of it, they stood in a silence that had the compressed density of everything that had not been said across 6 years of a marriage that was functional and cold, and she understood only now, lonely in ways she had been too busy to name. "The letters," he said again, quieter. "If I use them, you'll make a question mark," she said. "And the question mark will exist for approximately 1 week before everyone in this room understands who I am and what I've built and what Aldrich and I are actually doing, and then the question mark will become the answer to a question that damages you, not me." She watched him process this. "You're holding a weapon you don't know how to aim, Rowan, and the longer you hold it, the more likely it is to go off in the wrong direction." He stood very still. Lord Aldrich, the solicitor, had taken 2 small steps backward, which was the physical language of a man removing himself from a situation he had not anticipated and cannot manage. "Vivian told me to use them," Rowan said. It came out lower than everything else, with the specific quality of something said, because it could not be kept in any longer rather than because the speaker had decided to say it. Serafina looked at him. She looked at him, and she understood. In the particular way she understood things. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow completeness of a person who sees what is actually there. That the man in front of her was not the enemy she had been preparing for. He was something more complicated than an enemy, something that required a different kind of response than any she had prepared. He was a man who had made a catastrophic error and was now being guided in its escalation by a woman whose interests were not his interests, had never been his interests, and would never be his interests. He was a man who had discarded the person who understood him in favor of the person who was using him. And he knew it. That was the rawness around his eyes. He knew it and was not yet willing to name it. "Rowan, she said, and her voice shifted, not softened exactly, but changed in quality, the way a key changes when the lock it belongs to turns from the wrong direction to the right one. What does Vivian want from the summit today?" He blinked. "Not what she told you she wants. What does she actually want?" Something moved across his face, calculation, then resistance, then something that looked remarkably like the faint early stage of understanding, the stage that precedes full comprehension and is more painful than either ignorance or clarity. Before he could answer, the assembly bell rang for the end of recess, and from across the hall, from the position near the east wall where she had placed herself with such deliberate casualness, Vivian Hale moved. Not toward Rowan, not toward Serafina. She moved toward the assembly registrar's desk with the specific directness of a woman who has been waiting for a precise moment and has judged that the moment has arrived. She was carrying a document. Serafina recognized the weight of what she was seeing before she recognized the specific shape of it, recognized it in the way you recognize a threat not by its features, but by the particular quality of attention that converges on you when something irrevocable is about to happen. She saw the registrar look up. She saw Vivian set the document on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has rehearsed this motion. She saw the registrar look at it, and look at it again, and begin to read. Rowan turned and saw it too. And on his face, for the first time in the 2 weeks since the East drawing room, for the first time in what she suspected was much longer than that, was the expression of a man who has just understood something about the person beside him that cannot be unfound. "What is that?" he said, not to Serafina, to the air in front of him, to the fact of it. The registrar looked up from the document and across the assembly hall, and his gaze moved to the Valamont seat where Serafina had been sitting, and then to where she stood now, and his expression was the expression of a man holding something that has changed the shape of his afternoon. He stood. He lifted a small bell from the desk. He rang it twice, which was the signal for formal business requiring full assembly attention. The hall went quiet. Serafina stood between Rowan Blackthorne and the desk where his mistress had just filed something with the assembly registrar, and she felt the room turn toward her, and she felt the weight of 11 days of preparation and 6 years of invisibility and a seal she had carried without using for longer than she could justify. She felt all of it converge into this specific moment, this specific quality of attention, this room full of people who were about to learn who she was in the way she had wanted least and needed most. She had 2 seconds to decide what her face would do. She chose stillness. The registrar cleared his throat. The assembly recognizes a formal petition submitted by... He looked at the document. "Miss Vivian Hale, in the matter of the Valamont estate claim and its alleged conflict with the Blackthorne succession agreement of..." Rowan made a sound beside her. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man who has just discovered the specific shape of the trap he is standing in. "Rowan." Serafina spoke without looking at him, her eyes on the registrar. "Whatever she's filed. Whatever it says." She paused. One breath. The last quiet breath before a room full of people became the arena she had been moving toward since she pinned her own hair in the mirror of a life that was already ending. "It doesn't matter." "How can it not?" "Because I'm going to stand up in front of every person in this room," she said, "and I'm going to tell them exactly who I am. And when I'm done, there won't be a petition left to read." She finally looked at him. "The question is whether you stand beside me when I do." The registrar was still speaking. The room was still turning. Vivian, across the hall, had arranged her face into the expression of a woman who has executed a plan and is waiting for the results with the particular confidence of someone who cannot yet see that the results are not what she calculated. Rowan looked at Serafina. She looked back. In his eyes was the rawness she had been watching build for 2 weeks. The compound pain of a man finally seeing the true dimensions of what he had held and what he had thrown away. And underneath that pain was something older and harder, the stubbornness of a man who does not easily admit he was wrong and was in the precise moment of deciding whether he was going to admit it now. She did not wait for his decision. She turned toward the front of the assembly hall, and she moved, and the room parted around her the way rooms parted around people who had decided, finally and completely, to take up the space they deserved. Behind her, she heard a single footstep. Then another. She did not turn to see whose they were. She walked to the front of the room. She walked to the front of the room, and she did not look back. The footsteps behind her, one, then another, then the deliberate rhythm of a man who has made a decision and is living inside it now. She heard them and filed them and kept moving. The assembly hall was fully quiet in the way large rooms went quiet, when something was happening that everyone understood, without being told, was not procedural. The registrar stood at his desk with Vivian's document in his hand, and the particular expression of a man holding an object that has become more complicated than the object he was given. Serafina stopped at the center of the floor. She turned to face the room. There were perhaps 80 people in the assembly hall: lords, councillors, trade representatives, the senior staff of 3 provincial offices, 2 members of the Crown's advisory body. She had met perhaps 40 of them. She had conducted business, directly or through intermediaries, with perhaps 60. She knew, without false modesty and without performance, that she was the most informed person in the room about the room itself, about its relationships, its pressure points, its history, the invisible architecture of obligation and interest that made it function. She had built significant portions of that architecture. She had maintained others. She had repaired several that were failing. She had done all of it without anyone in this room knowing her name. That ended now. "My name is Serafina Valemont," she said. Her voice carried without effort, which was a function of the room's acoustics and her own steadiness, both of which she had accounted for. "Sole heir of House Valemont. I have been present in this assembly and in the business conducted around it for 6 years under the name Ashbourne, which is legally mine through my mother's line. I want to be precise about that. I did not lie about my name. I simply did not tell you all of it." The room was very still. "The document that has just been filed with the registrar," she glanced briefly at the registrar, who had the expression of a man grateful to be acknowledged, "concerns the Valemont estate claim on the Thorngate properties, which is a matter of property law that the appropriate offices are already reviewing and which will resolve through those channels without requiring assembly intervention." She paused. "I mention it only because it was filed here, in this room, at this moment, for reasons that have nothing to do with property law, and everything to do with the belief that a public forum is the appropriate place to conduct what is, at its foundation, a private attempt to damage a name before that name can speak for itself." She looked across the room. She found Vivian near the east wall, found her the way you find a specific face when you know exactly where it is. And she looked at her directly, which was something she had not done since the morning in the east drawing room. And she held the look for 3 seconds, which was long enough to say everything that needed saying without a word. Vivian's expression did not change, but her hands, folded in front of her in that practiced composure, moved. A small adjustment, a tightening. "I am not here to litigate a personal matter," Serafina continued, looking back at the room. "I am here because the business of this assembly touches, in several significant ways, matters that House Valemont has been managing for years and will continue to manage going forward. The Aldermere Corridor Agreement, the Thorngate Property Network, the Southern Trade Consortium's financial instrument." She let those land. She watched faces move as people who had been conducting business through channels they did not fully understand began to understand them. "I wanted you to know who you have been dealing with, and I wanted you to know that the work continues under its correct name, and that if any of you have questions about what that means for agreements currently in place, I am available to discuss them." She stopped. The silence held for a beat, 2 beats, the silence of a room processing a significant recalibration. Then Lord Creswell Hartley, from his position near the eastern corridor, began to applaud. It was not theatrical. It was the applause of a man who has spent 7 years conducting business with someone he respects and is now, for the first time, able to direct his respect at the correct face. 2 people beside him joined, then 4 more. The sound moved through the room in the particular way sound moved when it was genuine. Not all at once, not unanimous, but real. Serafina did not smile. She nodded once, the nod of a person receiving something they have earned rather than something they have been given, and she turned from the front of the room. Rowan Blackthorne was standing 6 feet behind her. He had followed her to the front of the room. He had stood there while she spoke. He was still standing there now, and his face had the quality she had glimpsed across the hall before she walked away from him. The raw, unguarded quality of a man who has just watched something happen that has reorganized his understanding of the last 6 years in real time, in public, in a room full of people who will remember it. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The Thorngate petition," he said. His voice was low, pitched only for her. "I didn't know she was going to file it here." "I know," she said. "The letters, I wasn't going to use them. I went to the solicitor because I didn't know what else to do, but I wasn't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I want you to know that." She studied him for a moment. She looked at the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of exhaustion in them, the way a man looked when he had been carrying something for 2 weeks that was too heavy and the wrong shape and that he had picked up because he had run out of other options. She had known this man for 8 years. She had been married to him for 6. She knew the difference between his manipulation and his honesty, and this was honesty. The rougher kind, the kind that arrived too late and without preparation, the kind that was worth less than it might have been and more than nothing. "I know," she said again. The applause in the room had settled. The assembly was beginning to reorganize itself around the new information, the way assemblies did, absorbed, redistributed, filed under the updated understanding, and moved past. The registrar had set Vivian's document down. Across the hall, Vivian herself had moved toward the exit, which Serafina noted without turning to look, the same way she noted most things. "What happens now?" Rowan said. "The assembly continues," she said. "The corridor agreement gets finalized. The Thorngate matter goes back to the property office where it belongs." She paused. "Your household navigates what comes next with the resources it actually has, which are not insignificant, Rowan. You have the estate, the northern land holdings, the Blackthorne name, which still carries weight. What you don't have is the infrastructure I was maintaining on your behalf. You'll need to build something in its place." He looked at her with the expression of a man taking inventory of a house after a flood, assessing what's standing, what's gone, what might be salvaged. "Will you—" he started, stopped, tried again with the particular difficulty of a man whose pride was in direct conflict with his need. "Is there any version of this where—" "No," she said, gently. More gently than she had said anything to him in 2 weeks, possibly in 2 years. "There isn't." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched him take the shape of it and file it somewhere that would hurt for a long time, which was the appropriate place for it. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were quiet and unadorned, and did not ask for anything in return, which was the only form in which she could have received them. "I know," she said for the 3rd time. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved the truth, at least once, without the buffer of strategy around it. "So am I." She left him standing at the center of the assembly hall floor and went to find Lord Hartley, because there was a corridor agreement to finalize and a room full of people who now knew her name. The petition Vivian filed was withdrawn 3 days later. Serafina learned this through Octavia, who had learned it through the property office, and she received the information without particular satisfaction, which continued to be the dominant quality of her response to things that were going as they should. Satisfaction required a kind of distance from events, a settled retrospect, and she was not yet settled. She was still inside of it, still inside the building of something, the daily work of turning what she had declared in the assembly hall into what it actually was. The Thorngate claim resolved in her favor on a Tuesday, 9 days after the summit. The documentation came through Marin Holst's office, processed with the correct pressure applied through the correct channels, and Serafina sat in her rooms at the Meridian Club and read it with the focus of a woman checking the accuracy of a legal document rather than the relief of one receiving a victory, because accuracy was what the document required and relief was something she could afford later. She wrote to Garrison Fell that afternoon with the first full set of instructions she had given him in 6 years, full, explicit, signed with her real name, outlining the restoration of House Valamont's active operations across 3 provinces. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she set the pen down and looked out the window at the city in its late afternoon light, and she understood, sitting there, that she had been building toward this letter for longer than she had been conscious of building toward anything. Her father would have recognized what she was doing. He had understood her in the particular way of fathers who see their children clearly and do not look away from what they see. Understood that she was a person who needed a problem of sufficient scale, that she would find lesser problems and solve them for other people if she was not given adequate scope for her own. He had not in the end left her adequate scope. He had left her a name and a seal and an estate in complicated condition, and the instruction delivered in his last weeks with the bluntness of a man who knew he was out of time to not let anyone convince her that what she was capable of was less than it was. She had spent 6 years letting someone do exactly that, not through cruelty. That was the thing she had to keep reminding herself in the quiet of the Meridian Club, in the space that was becoming not a temporary arrangement, but a home. Rowan had not been cruel. He had been incurious, which was its own kind of damage. The damage that came from a person who looked at you and saw a function rather than a fact, who registered your usefulness without registering your existence. She had permitted it because permission was easier than demand, and demand required her to be fully visible, and visible meant risking being seen as too much by a man who had chosen her partly for the quality of her restraint. She had restrained herself into invisibility. That, she understood now, sitting in the light of the city she was learning to move through under her own name, was the actual error. Not marrying Rowan, not managing his affairs, not spending 6 years building something in someone else's name. Those were choices made in specific circumstances, and she could not fully repudiate them because they had made her what she was, had given her the knowledge and the relationships and the operational fluency that were now the foundation of everything she was building. The error was not the work. The error was the belief that the work had to be invisible to be acceptable, that she had to be behind the wall to be safe. She was not behind anything anymore. Vivian Hale left Blackthorn House 6 weeks after the summit. The departure was quiet, which surprised people who had expected drama, and did not surprise Serafina, who understood that Vivian was above all things practical. The situation at Blackthorn House had become, by that point, a losing one. The finances constrained, the social position diminished, the man at the center of it no longer the asset he had appeared to be when she had first calculated what he was worth. Vivian had made a calculation, and the calculation had changed, and she was a woman who updated her calculations. The child, a daughter, born in the spring, remained with Rowan. Serafina learned this through Dorothea, who had stayed at Blackthorn House and who wrote brief, factual letters that contained exactly the information Serafina needed, and nothing extra, which was a form of loyalty she had not asked for and was grateful for. She did not involve herself in what happened at Blackthorn House after that. It was not her house. It had not been, in any meaningful sense, for a long time. She saw that clearly now, saw that she had been maintaining the form of a life there without inhabiting the substance of it, that she had been present without being home. The estate would manage. The Blackthorn name had foundation beneath the infrastructure she had built, and Rowan was not, for all his failures, an incompetent man. He would rebuild at a smaller scale and in different shape, and the daughter would grow up in a house that was diminished but functional, and that would have to be enough, because the alternative, returning to manage what she had left, from any motive including pity, was the one thing she would not do. She had earned the right to build something for herself. She was going to use it. The Valamont estate received its first major guests in the autumn, 6 months after the summit, when Serafina opened the house properly for the first time in over a decade. It was not a social event. She had no interest in social performance for its own sake, had never had it, had attended the functions of her former life because they were where the work happened, rather than because she enjoyed them. This was a working gathering. Hartley, Belson, Octavia, Marin Holst, 3 members of the Southern Trade Consortium, Garrison Fell, and Prince Aldrich Voss, who arrived last and looked at the restored house with the expression of a man seeing something he had understood theoretically and is now understanding actually. They worked for 2 days. They ate in the large dining room that Garrison had prepared with the quiet pride of a man whose family had been waiting for this specific occasion for 11 years. And they talked over dinner about things that were not business, which was itself a form of business, the kind that built the connective tissue between people who were going to do difficult things together and needed to know they could. On the second evening, Aldrich found her on the west terrace in the hour before the light failed, looking out over the grounds that were just beginning to recover from a decade of limited management. The gardens not yet what they would be, the stone paths still uneven in places, the whole of it carrying the visible evidence of time and neglect that was also, from the right angle, the visible evidence of something that had survived and was coming back. "How does it feel?" he said. She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "Like something that was always going to happen," she said. "Which I mean as a practical observation, not a comfortable one. It took longer than it should have. I allowed it to take longer." "You were building while you waited." "I was hiding while I built." She looked at him. "There's a difference. The building was real. The hiding was the error." He was quiet for a moment. In the particular way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say something he had been carrying. "You could have done all of this 6 years ago," he said. "If you'd taken the Valemont name from the beginning. If you'd positioned yourself correctly." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She thought about the honest answer, about the girl she had been at 22, who had understood what she was worth and had not yet understood that the understanding itself was the permission, that no one was going to grant it, that it was not a thing granted, that it was a thing claimed, who had married a man and spent 6 years proving her value to someone who had never thought to question it, because the proving felt safer than the claiming. "I wanted to be chosen," she said, "for what I was rather than what I carried." She looked back out over the grounds. "I thought, if I came in without the name, without the estate, without any of it, just as myself, and someone chose that, it would mean something. It would be real in a way that the other kind couldn't be. And instead I was not chosen," she said, without self-pity, which she had used up in the first weeks and had not replenished because it was not useful, which taught me something that needed learning. She paused. "That being chosen is not the measure of your worth. It is one thing that can happen to you. It is not the thing that defines you." She looked at him. "I define me. I should have understood that at 22. I understand it now." Aldrich looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize in him. Not assessment, not calculation, but something more direct than either. The look of a person who sees what is actually there. "The consortium meeting in the spring," he said. "You'll need a larger venue." "I know. I'm having the East Wing restored." She allowed the corner of her mouth to move, which was the expression she used when something was both amusing and accurate. "Garrison has opinions about the stonework. Garrison has opinions about everything. He's usually right." She turned back to the house. Through the West Wing windows, she could see the warm light of the dining room, the shapes of people moving in it, the particular quality of a house in use. "Come in," she said. "Hartley is going to want to start the corridor figures tonight, and he'll do it without us if we give him the opportunity." She moved toward the door. Aldrich followed. She heard the terrace stones under their feet and the early evening sounds of the grounds coming back to themselves, and she felt the house around her as she stepped inside. Felt it the way you felt something that was yours, not given, not permitted, but actually and fundamentally and irreversibly yours. Rowan came to the Valemont estate once, in the late autumn, when the grounds were brown and the air had the bite of the coming cold. He came alone, without the solicitor, without announcement, which told her something. Garrison brought her the information that a carriage bearing the Blackthorn crest had arrived at the gate, and she thought for a moment, and she told Garrison to let it through. She received him in the front sitting room, which was warm and simply furnished, nothing performative about it. He came in, and he looked at the room, and then at her, and he had changed in the months since the summit, not dramatically, not in the way of a man broken by consequence, but in the way of a man who has been through something that has moved things inside him to different positions. The compressed energy was gone from his posture. What remained was something quieter, which on Rowan Blackthorn she would not have predicted. He sat when she gestured, which he had not done in the Meridian Club meeting room. "My daughter's name is Clara," he said. She had known this. She said nothing. "She has—" He stopped. Tried again. "She's healthy. She's extraordinary, actually." There was something in his voice that had not been there before, something that had arrived with the child and had not left. "I didn't expect that she'd be extraordinary. That I'd—" He looked at the floor briefly, then back. "That I would feel this particular way about a person I had not met yet." He said it with the difficulty of a man who is not accustomed to saying accurate things about his interior life, and is doing it anyway, because the alternative is worse. "I'm telling you because I thought you deserved to know that something real came out of the choices I made, even if most of the rest of it was costly," she said. "Costly," he agreed. They sat with that for a moment in the warm room with the autumn outside and the sound of the house around them. "Serafina." His voice had dropped to the register she associated with the Rowan she had occasionally glimpsed behind the Rowan she had married, the one who was not performing authority but was simply, underneath everything, a person. "I am sorry. Not as a strategy. Not because I need something from you." He held her eyes. "I'm genuinely sorry for what I did and for what I failed to see, and I understand that the apology doesn't constitute repair. I just needed you to hear it said correctly." She looked at him. She took her time with it, the looking, gave it the attention it deserved. "I hear it," she said. She did not say it was all right, because it had not all been all right, and she had stopped softening accurate things for the comfort of the person she was saying them to. She did not say she forgave him, because forgiveness was not a performance she owed him, or an event she had planned. It was a process she was inside of, private and ongoing, that had more to do with herself than with him. The work of releasing the 6 years not in anger, not in recrimination, but in the slow, honest reckoning of a woman deciding what she was going to carry forward and what she was going to set down. She was setting quite a lot down. "Clara should know the Valamont name," she said, "not as an obligation, as a fact of the world she's going to be moving through. Whoever she is, she'll encounter it, and she should understand what it is." Rowan looked at her with an expression she had no name for. "You'd allow that." "I'd allow what's accurate," she said. "She's part of a history. She should know her history." She paused. "That's as far as I'll go, Rowan, but it's something." He nodded. Once, the same nod she had seen on him across years of negotiation. The nod of a man who has received the actual terms and is accepting them because the actual terms are what there are. He left before dark. She stood at the window and watched the Blackthorn carriage move down the estate's long front drive and through the gates and out onto the road that led back to the city, and she watched until it was small and then gone, and she stood for a moment in the quiet of the room after it. She thought about the girl she had been, about the seal in her pocket across 6 years of someone else's life, about the wall and the cold and the long patient work of being indispensable to someone who did not think to ask what it cost. She thought about what it had cost. She made an honest accounting of it, not minimizing, not dramatizing, just the true figure, the real number. It had cost time, which she could not recover. It had cost the particular kind of grief that came from loving someone poorly. Not Rowan, she had not loved Rowan, but the version of herself she had constructed around the project of earning his recognition. She had loved that version with the desperate devotion of a person who has confused the effort with the worth. She did not love it anymore. What she understood now, standing in the window of a house that was hers in the last light of an autumn afternoon, was that the years were not wasted. They could not be wasted because they had made her what she was, and what she was stood here, built, operational, clear-eyed, and hers. The error had been the teacher. The hiding had been the making. She could not have walked into the assembly hall and spoken with that precision if she had not spent 6 years learning, in someone else's name, exactly what precision looked like and what it cost. She had paid for her education with the currency of her invisibility. She was done being invisible. House Valemont was restored. The corridor held. The work continued. It would always continue. That was the nature of work. It did not arrive at a final state, but moved forward, required attention, rewarded precision. She had people around her who understood what they were building and were building it beside her rather than benefiting from it at a distance. And that difference, the difference between people who built with you and people who simply lived in what you built, was something she understood in her bones in a way she had not at 22. She turned from the window. Garrison had left a lamp burning on the writing desk. The estate papers were stacked in their orderly arrangement, Garrison's work, meticulous as always, everything in its place, everything ready for the morning. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the desk, felt the wood under her palms, solid and warm from the lamp's proximity. She had letters to write. She picked up her pen. Outside, the last of the autumn light left the grounds of Valemont Estate, and the house held the dark the way houses that have been lived in properly held it, not as absence, but as its own kind of fullness, the quiet of a place where someone is at work and knows what they are doing and will be there when the morning comes. She wrote until the lamp needed attending. She attended it herself. Then she wrote on.